On a quiet corner in Charleston, South Carolina, there was a charming little cafe called Café La Lune. It was known for its crisp lemon tarts and the soft sound of piano music that drifted through the air every Saturday afternoon. It was there on a damp April afternoon that Mrs. Thelma Hayes, a black woman in her 70s with silver hair neatly pinned up and tortoiseshell glasses, walked into the cafe, bringing with her a gentle scent of lavender and the calm presence of someone who had seen much in life. Mrs. Thelma wore an old but clean moss green coat and carried a fabric tote embroidered with roses. Her steps were slow but steady. She paused at the entrance, glanced around the room, then made her way to the host stand and asked softly, "Dear, may I sit by the window?" Behind the counter was a young woman named Liz, likely in her early 20s, who looked up at Mrs. Thelma with a barely concealed impatience. Her eyes flicked to the older woman's simple clothing, and her expression tightened slightly. "The window tables are for reservations only," she replied. "Oh, I don't mind waiting," Mrs. Thelma said, her warm smile unwavering. Liz pressed her lips together and didn't respond. She tapped a few keys on her computer, then turned away, leaving the elderly woman standing there alone. No one else in the cafe seemed to notice her, except for an older man in the far corner sipping a cappuccino, who frowned slightly at Liz's behavior. After nearly 10 minutes of quiet waiting, Mrs. Thelma was finally led to a table near the restroom, far from the window, far from the music, and far from kindness. The server set the menu down without making eye contact and walked off without a word. And yet, if Liz had bothered to ask a few more questions or taken a closer look at the way the woman chose peppermint tea over coffee, she might have realized this was no ordinary guest. That embroidered tote bag had once been a gift at an international conference, one reserved for honored speakers only. But Liz didn't ask, and she didn't care. At exactly 4:15, the wall clock chimed and a piano piece began to play. Debussy's Clair de Lune, as gentle as spring water weaving through leaves. The soft melody seemed to hush the entire cafe for a moment. But at Mrs. Thelma's table there was a different kind of silence, not the stillness brought by music, but the quiet weight of judgment. Mrs. Thelma sat upright, her gaze resting on the distant window where the late sunlight cast shadows on the white curtains. A different waitress, named Emma, noticed her and frowned slightly. "Liz, that elderly lady's at table 9, right? Why'd you seat her there? That's the table where the kitchen staff usually take breaks." Liz shrugged, replying in a low voice without bothering to cover her mouth. "Probably just a drifter. She asked for a window seat, but didn't make a reservation. I figured any spot would do. As long as she orders something, what's the big deal?" Emma glanced at Mrs. Thelma again, her expression uncertain, then turned away. And Mrs. Thelma? She remained seated, as if she hadn't heard a thing. But in truth, those ears had listened to thousands of speeches at major conferences, had sat through hundreds of banquets where tuxedos and honorary badges were the norm. She understood every nuance in a voice, every awkward silence that followed forced laughter. And she was no stranger to being judged by appearances. A boy about 10 years old walked past her table holding a cup of hot chocolate. He stared at her and asked innocently, "Ma'am, are you sad sitting all alone?" Mrs. Thelma smiled, leaned in slightly, and replied softly, "No, sweetheart. I'm sitting with memories, and sometimes they make the best company." The boy grinned and ran back to his table where his mother, a white woman in an expensive trench coat, was eyeing Mrs. Thelma with a puzzled look, as if something didn't quite add up. Just then, the piano shifted into a soft jazz piece. A middle-aged man in a slate blue suit walked into the cafe holding a leather folder. His eyes scanned the room quickly, then stopped when he saw Mrs. Thelma. He immediately made his way over, his expression shifting, respectful, concerned. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm so sorry I'm late. Everyone's waiting upstairs in the conference room. Would you like to finish your tea here, or shall we head up now?" Liz froze, her mouth slightly open. As for Mrs. Thelma, she took one more sip of her peppermint tea, set the cup down, and smiled. "I think it's time we go. Thank you for waiting." And still she sat for just a moment more, her hands gently brushing the table's surface, eyes distant as if recalling something long ago. She wasn't angry, wasn't upset, just quiet. A strange kind of quiet, as if she were waiting for someone or preparing for something yet to come. The elevator at the Horizon building opened with a soft chime, polite and unrushed. The man named Marcus, the executive assistant, stepped out first and held the door for Mrs. Thelma. He gently gestured for her to enter a large conference room where the afternoon light streamed through clear glass, reflecting off the glossy walnut table. 6 people were already seated, all dressed in formal business attire. On the table, documents were neatly arranged, a glass of water placed at the top right of each setting, and in the center, an empty chair, the head seat. Mrs. Thelma walked toward it with quiet grace. Her hands didn't tremble, even though her legs no longer moved as swiftly as they had at 40. But in her eyes was the same fire that once commanded rooms full of skeptical stares, defending a project or dismantling a flawed budget down to the last penny. Marcus pulled out the chair for her. And as she draped her thin wool scarf over the back of it, everyone in the room stood, like part of a ritual no one needed to be reminded of. A woman in the group with a short haircut and gold-rimmed glasses spoke gently. "It's an honor to have you with us, Mrs. Hayes. Today's meeting will begin whenever you're ready. All materials related to the Community Development Fund have been prepared." Mrs. Thelma nodded, glanced around the room, then replied softly, "Let's begin then, but first I want you all to know, on my way up here, I had a little lesson downstairs." The room chuckled, not quite knowing the story, but everyone understood one thing clearly. That older black woman with the soft silver hair was none other than the honorary chair of the Global Innovation Fund, a former economics professor at Stanford, a senior financial advisor to 3 major NGOs, and most recently, the strategist behind a housing policy reform campaign in 6 major cities. "Did you come here alone?" Marcus asked. "Oh no," she said. "I came with a belief that sometimes people need a gentle reminder. Expensive cars and tailored blazers don't determine who deserves respect." Her gaze wasn't sharp, nor was her voice loud. It passed through the room like a breeze, just enough to knock lightly on the door of one's conscience. And as the meeting began, full of numbers and proposals, downstairs, Liz the waitress was still wiping down the counter. Her eyes kept drifting to the empty table by the window, where the last light of day touched the faint imprint of a teacup. That afternoon, the cafe in the lobby remained as quiet as ever, with only the ticking of the wall clock clearly audible. Liz, the young waitress who had just finished a shift with a strange aftertaste, sat dazed behind the counter, still holding a cleaning cloth, her eyes no longer focused on any cup or glass. She was thinking about the old woman with the gentle smile whom she had unconsciously dismissed, about the look that held no reproach, the old but clean leather bag, and most of all, that line, "Seems I need to learn how to dress in a way that earns me decent service." At first, Liz had planned to forget about it. Strangers came and went, who dwells on a tiny moment like that? But as she reached for the now cold iced tea to pour it down the sink, her eyes paused, as if a whisper had just risen in her mind. This tea isn't cold because she sat there too long. It's cold because I didn't think she was important enough to deserve it hot. The thought tightened something in Liz's chest. That's right. She used to take pride in her ability to read people, took pride in sizing up a guest with just a glance, but now she realized some glances are traps of our own making. And then, as if something nudged her, she turned on the computer behind the counter and typed in the name Thelma Hayes. The screen took less than 2 seconds to respond. Thelma L. Hayes, Senior Advisor on Global Economic Policy, co-founder of the Global Innovation Fund, former professor at Stanford University. Below was a photo of her in a dark suit speaking at a major conference among a lineup of highly distinguished speakers. And strangely, her eyes looked just the same, gentle, resolute, and deeply compassionate. Liz shivered slightly, not from fear, but from shame. She felt as though she had just missed a chance to become a better version of herself because of one fleeting moment of shallow judgment. She cleaned the tea glass again, scrubbing more carefully than usual, and placed it neatly on the shelf. In her heart, a quiet decision had formed. Tomorrow, if that woman came back, she would be the first to stand up, not to make amends, but to learn how to be a better human being. Upstairs, Thelma's meeting ended with a round of light, but spirited applause, and downstairs a cold cup of tea had just awakened a young woman. Liz sat numbly in the corner of the HR office, her hands twisted tightly together, as if searching for something to hold on to in a collapsing world. She had just been informed of her suspension pending investigation, and her manager's words echoed in her ears like a blunt knock at the door of fate. If what's been reported is accurate, we'll have no choice but to terminate your contract. She could hardly believe it. Just yesterday, she was a hardworking college student pulling double shifts to cover her tuition. And now her future felt like a fragile thread about to snap, all because of one dismissive glance, one careless remark, one hasty judgment based solely on someone's modest appearance. Liz knew she was wrong for letting bias seep into her work. But she hadn't expected her actions to be observed and reported at such a high level. Thelma's assistant, a man in a dark suit, courteous but firm, had quietly approached the restaurant manager later that evening. No fuss, no raised voices, just a few lines in an email, but enough to set the entire system in motion like a silent command triggering an internal investigation. Liz fought back tears. She remembered Thelma's eyes, not angry, not accusing, just quiet. The kind of look someone gives when they've seen enough of the world to recognize a young woman walking straight into quicksand without realizing it. She had planned to apologize the next day, but Thelma had already left the hotel. Her assistant offered a brief response. "We don't have time to entertain unprofessional behavior." Liz felt like she'd been slammed against a cold wall, fear rushing over her like the first icy wind of winter. That night, she sat in front of her computer screen, staring at the tuition balance for the next semester. She'd done the math. If she lost this job, school would be out of reach. She wouldn't even have the courage to call her mom back in Michigan, who still believed, wholeheartedly, that her daughter was strong and doing great. Liz placed a hand on her chest. Not because her heart ached, but because for the first time in her life she felt so ashamed it hurt to breathe. Not from the fear of losing her job, but from the crushing truth that the woman she had dismissed as just an old lady now held the power to determine her future and might not forgive her. What Liz didn't know was this: sometimes in life, the person you've hurt the most is the very one who reaches out a hand to pull you from the edge. 3 days had passed since Liz was suspended from work. Calls from HR offered no further explanations, and no one would reveal what the next steps might be. For Liz, time dragged on unbearably. She couldn't finish a single meal, and studying was out of the question. At night, she lay awake, turning over one question in her mind. Will I lose everything because of one foolish moment? On Tuesday morning, as a fine mist of rain wrapped the city like strands of silver thread, Liz stood silently outside the hotel where Mrs. Thelma was staying. She hadn't made an appointment, didn't even know if she'd be received, but something deep inside told her that if she didn't speak up, she'd live with the regret forever. The woman who greeted her was tall and lean, middle-aged, wearing glasses and a perfectly tailored gray suit. Mrs. Thelma's personal assistant, Miss Hartley, stepped out with a stern expression, showing no sign of warmth. Her gaze fixed on Liz as if trying to read the very purpose of her existence. "Do you want to see Mrs. Thelma?" Hartley asked, her tone not exactly cold, but incredibly professional, almost devoid of emotion. Liz nodded, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. I want to apologize. I won't have peace until I say it directly to her." Hartley stood silent for a moment, then replied firmly, "Mrs. Thelma is not available right now, and honestly, I don't think she needs to hear that apology." The words landed like a slap with no sound. But it didn't stop there. Hartley stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough for Liz to hear. "The service industry isn't for people who let their emotions dictate their behavior. Kindness isn't a choice, it's a standard. If you lack the character to understand that, then maybe you should reconsider the path you've chosen." Liz lowered her gaze, her throat tight with bitterness. She felt like a child who had just been stripped of her last coat in the cold night snow. All she had, her regret, her sincerity, and even her belief in a second chance was left behind, shut out beyond that closed door. She turned away, her steps heavy as stone. Hartley's words echoed in her mind, without malice, but a harsh truth. If you lack the character, then don't work in the service industry. What Liz didn't know was that behind the curtain on the third floor, a pair of eyes were quietly watching, and that this was far from over. That Friday, it rained again. Not the light drizzle from the day Liz had gone to the hotel, but a heavy downpour, as if the sky was as anxious as she was. She wore a white shirt and black trousers, the restaurant's uniform. Although she had been suspended, today she was called in for an internal meeting to hear the official decision from the management. She knew this could be her farewell, and she had braced herself for the worst. The second floor meeting room was still the usual space for regular staff and management meetings. It was a small room with a long wooden table, a few potted plants in the corners, and a whiteboard with faded writing from past training sessions. Present that day were the branch manager, Mr. Howard, two direct managers, and one person who took everyone by surprise, Mrs. Thelma. She entered with a calm demeanor, wearing an amber coat, a silk scarf lightly draped around her neck, and a classic brown leather bag. She still carried the composed elegance of someone who had weathered many storms in life. But there was something in the way she looked at Liz, not in anger, not in pity, but with a deep understanding. Liz froze. Her heart raced, her hands damp with sweat. 100 worries flooded her mind. Could she be here to witness me getting fired? Mr. Howard spoke first. We are here to review the case of employee Liz. Discriminatory behavior, poor service attitude, failure to adhere to customer service guidelines. Liz lowered her head. She didn't offer any defense. Any explanation seemed too late now. But just as Mr. Howard was about to announce the final decision, Mrs. Thelma gently raised her hand, interrupting him. Excuse me, but I would like to say something if I may. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to silence the entire room. Mr. Howard appeared slightly flustered. Of course, Mrs. Thelma. Please, go ahead. She stood up, walked to the head of the table. A moment of silence, then she looked straight at Liz, who was still with her head lowered in shame, and began speaking. I have worked for over 40 years in human resources consulting, hired thousands of people, and trained hundreds of managers. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. No one is born perfect. We grow from our mistakes, as long as we recognize them and learn from them. The room seemed to freeze. I have witnessed a young woman, under pressure, let her emotions overshadow her reason. But it was also that same young woman who, instead of hiding in fear, came to me, not to make excuses, but to apologize. Not with words, but with a sincere gaze and an attitude of regret. She paused for a second, then turned to Mr. Howard. And that is why I asked the management to revoke the termination decision. I believe that everyone deserves a second chance, especially young people trying to find their way. Liz raised her head. Her eyes welled up. Mrs. Thelma continued, I am not defending the wrong, but I believe in change, and I choose to place my trust in those who are willing to correct themselves. No one spoke. A heavy silence enveloped the room. Liz's direct manager glanced at Mr. Howard as if waiting for instructions, but he merely nodded slightly. I agree, he says, will be kept on, but with conditions. A 3-month probation, close supervision, and completion of a refresher training on service skills. Liz burst into tears, not out of joy, but because she never expected, in the midst of what seemed like losing everything, that a hand would reach out like this. She turned to Mrs. Thelma and bowed deeply. Thank you for not giving up on me. Mrs. Thelma simply smiled, her kind eyes gleaming with a firm resolve. Thank you for not giving up on yourself. After that meeting, Liz stood still in the hotel lobby, where the brilliant chandeliers reflected on the floor like falling stars. She had just walked out of the fateful room where she had thought her future would close like an old door. But no, it opened, thanks to a woman she had once looked down on. A light breeze brushed against her cheek, but it couldn't dry the tears that fell down the face of the young woman. She cried, not because of fear anymore. She cried for something greater. Regret, gratitude, and a deep sense of shame when she realized she had misjudged a person. As she stepped down the stairs, Liz saw Mrs. Thelma's figure preparing to leave. Unable to hold back her emotions, she ran to her, her voice choking. Mrs. Thelma, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry for treating you badly. I had no reason. I just lived with prejudice, and that made me disgusted with myself. Mrs. Thelma turned around, her gaze gentle as if she had been waiting for this moment. You've shown more courage than many, Liz. Recognizing your mistakes, admitting them, and apologizing with all your heart, it's not something everyone can do. Then she placed her hand on Liz's shoulder and gently added, Don't let this mistake define who you are, but never forget it. Let it remind you every day to become a better person. From that day on, Liz changed completely. Not because she feared being fired, but because she truly wanted to deserve the opportunity she had been given. She became the earliest to arrive and the latest to leave. She began to listen to every customer, not just with her ears, but with her heart. She smiled at the most difficult customers, wiped tables with gentle hands, and served as if each meal were a feast. Her colleagues, who were initially astonished, gradually came to admire her. The manager who had once been stern with her now nodded when he saw her pass by. There were afternoons when Liz quietly helped others swap shifts, and on holidays she would volunteer to stay, just to ensure everything was in order. She even started learning communication skills and customer service management in the evenings to gain a deeper understanding of the field she was working in. Every time she picked up a glass, handed a napkin to a customer, she would remember Mrs. Thelma's gaze, one that wasn't angry but made her change her entire perspective on life. That year, Liz graduated from college with honors. She received a scholarship from a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping students overcome hardships. But what she was most proud of wasn't the degree, but the essay she wrote to accompany her application, an essay titled "The Woman Who Did Not Get Angry." In the essay, Liz didn't talk about grades or academic efforts. She shared a story about a rainy fall evening when she, a server with a heart full of prejudice, had hurt a customer simply because she looked different from the people she usually served. She described how the woman didn't get angry, didn't react harshly, but instead used calmness and kindness to make Liz reflect on herself. She wrote, "I used to think power lay in status, luxurious uniforms, or black credit cards. But that day I realized that true power is when you are strong enough to forgive someone who has hurt you. That woman didn't need to get angry to make me change. She just needed to be present in a quiet yet weighty way." That story moved the admissions committee. But most importantly, Liz, the one who wrote it, had become a completely different person whenever an employee disappointed. Many years later, when Liz became a hotel manager at a well-known service chain, she still kept that essay in her desk drawer. Whenever she faced difficulties, whenever an employee disappointed her, she would open it and read it to remind herself, patience and compassion can save a person, just like they once saved me. And occasionally, on those light, rainy autumn afternoons, she would still think of Mrs. Thelma, the woman who did not get angry, but had changed her entire life with one simple choice: to give someone a second chance. That winter, when her work had settled into a routine, Liz sat by the window of her small apartment, the yellow light casting a glow on the white page she was writing on. Beside her was an envelope, carefully written with the words, "To Mrs. Thelma." It was the first time in years that Liz had decided to reach out to the woman who had given her a second chance. She had planned to do this for a long time, but had always hesitated, partly out of shame, partly because she didn't feel worthy. Now, having become a better person, Liz knew she couldn't let another day pass without saying thank you. In the letter, she spoke about her new job, the essay, "The Woman Who Did Not Get Angry," that had changed the course of her life. She wrote with all her sincerity, hoping to invite Mrs. Thelma to dinner as a late but heartfelt gesture of thanks. Liz sent the letter, along with her contact information. But weeks passed with no response. She started calling the old addresses, inquiring through familiar channels. Finally, an old colleague from the hotel gave her a lead. Mrs. Thelma's assistant, Mrs. Celeste, was now working at a local charity organization. Liz arrived at the office of the charity organization one late afternoon. She waited quietly in the lobby, holding a second envelope just in case she needed to send it again. When Mrs. Hartley emerged, her demeanor was as stern as before, but her eyes softened when she saw Liz. "Are you looking for Mrs. Thelma?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Liz nodded, her heart suddenly beating faster. "She passed away nearly a year ago, dear, quietly, just like the way she lived." Liz's heart tightened. She lowered her head, clutching the letter she had never sent. Silent tears fell. "She always watched over you," Mrs. Hartley continued. "After that day, she told me to let you grow on your own. Sometimes the best thing we can do for someone is step back so they can keep moving forward on their own." Liz stood still for a long while. She handed the envelope to Mrs. Hartley. "Please, keep it for me," as a way to let her know I never forgot. That day, as she stepped out of the building, the rain began to fall softly. Liz looked up, letting the raindrops fall on her cheeks like a silent farewell, and she smiled, knowing that some people come into our lives only for a moment, but leave an everlasting mark. Thelma was one of those people.
Hi, Miss Ellie here. Mrs. Thelma's story reminds me of a time when people would rush to judge each other based solely on appearances or an unfamiliar name. Mrs. Thelma, with her neatly tied gray hair and embroidered flower bag, walked into the cafe just like everyone else. But that young girl, Liz, only saw an ordinary old woman, someone unimportant. She didn't notice the steady steps or the experienced gaze of someone who had lived through many winters in life. When we're young, sometimes we think we know everything, don't we? We quickly categorize who deserves our respect and who doesn't. But then, life has a way of teaching us lessons that no classroom ever could. Liz had to learn that kindness and compassion aren't just for those we deem deserving. They should be a way of life, because we never know who is standing before us. Maybe it's someone who paved the way for an entire generation, or simply the only person who dares to give us a second chance when the whole world turns away. Mrs. Thelma didn't get angry, nor did she seek revenge. She simply chose to forgive, and in doing so, she taught Liz a lesson in compassion, in nobility, without any loud words or gestures. So the lesson for today, if I may draw one, is this: never underestimate a person, and never miss the opportunity to treat someone with kindness. Because who knows, the person you look down on may be the one who lifts you up when you need it most. And perhaps just a small act of kindness could be the very thing that turns someone's life in a better direction.